The governor of California has just held an emergency press conference, voice shaking, fists pounding on the podium. Not because of wildfires, not because of an earthquake, not because of a budget crisis, but because one of America's largest energy companies has just announced it is pulling its headquarters out of the state for good. Chevron, a 145-year-old corporate giant that has called California home since 1879, is leaving, and the consequences are already rippling through refineries, gas stations, tax revenue projections, and the wallets of 40 million people who are about to find out what happens when you lose critical energy infrastructure in real time. I'm Nora Smith, and on this channel, we don't wait for the corporate spin. We follow the money, the timelines, and the decisions that shape your life, whether you're paying attention or not. If you value journalism that connects the dots before the crisis hits your doorstep, subscribe now. Hit the like button and answer this question in the comments. Do you think a state can survive in the long run if it drives out its biggest industries? I read every response and share this video because what is happening in California today is a model being watched by policymakers in every state capital in the country. Here is the core of what you need to understand. Chevron's departure is not a symbolic move. It is not a negotiation tactic. It is not a political trick. It is the result of a decade-long accumulation of regulatory costs, litigation threats, permitting delays, and tax hikes that have made operating a Fortune 500 headquarters in California mathematically unsustainable. This isn't about politics. It is about incentive structures, infrastructure fragility, and the brutal economics of energy production in a state that consumes more gasoline than any other but refuses to let anyone build the capacity to supply it. I'm going to guide you through the timeline, the money, the decisions that led to this, and who is going to pay the price, because it won't be the governor and it won't be the Chevron executives. Chevron has had its headquarters in San Ramon, California for decades. At its peak, the company employed more than 60,000 people across the state: refinery workers, engineers, logistics specialists, corporate staff. It operated 4 refineries in California, representing approximately 20% of the state's total refining capacity. This capacity matters because California's fuel standards are unique. The state requires a special blend of gasoline that cannot be easily imported from other states or countries. Translation: if California loses refining capacity, it cannot simply order more supply from Texas or Alaska. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The fuel is custom made. And now, a decade of hostile policies has finally reached the breaking point. 4,000 direct jobs lost, $1.2 billion in annual economic activity disappearing, and gas prices that will explode to $7, $8, even $9 a gallon because the state dismantled its own supply infrastructure. Let me show you exactly how we got to this point, because when you see the sequence of events, it is impossible to call this an accident. Over the last 12 years, California began implementing a series of policies designed to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. Cap-and-trade programs, low-carbon fuel standards, bans on new oil and gas drilling permits, setback requirements that prohibited drilling within 3,200 feet of homes, schools, or hospitals, a rule that in practice made almost all new drilling in populated areas impossible. Each policy taken individually could be justified as environmental progress, but stacked together year after year, they created a regulatory environment that made long-term capital investment in California energy infrastructure a losing bet. In 2019, Chevron had already begun to signal concern. Internal documents later revealed at shareholder meetings showed the company projecting that California's regulatory trajectory would reduce refining margins by 14% over the next decade. 14% might not seem catastrophic, but in the refining business, where profit margins are often in the single digits, that is the difference between profitability and closure. Chevron didn't announce anything publicly yet. They waited, lobbied, tried to negotiate exemptions and compliance deadlines with state regulators. Nothing worked. Then came the lawsuits. In 2017, the cities of San Francisco and Oakland sued Chevron along with several other oil companies for damages related to climate change. The lawsuits sought billions of dollars in compensation for sea level rise, infrastructure damage, and future adaptation costs. Other California cities followed. By 2021, Chevron was facing more than a dozen separate climate liability lawsuits in California courts, each carrying potential damages in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. But more important than the rising legal costs, the lawsuits created long-term uncertainty. How do you plan a 20-year capital investment in a refinery when you don't know if a jury will hold you liable for 100 billion in climate damages 5 years from now? Let that sink in. Chevron was being asked to continue operating refineries that supplied fuel to the very cities that were suing them for supplying fuel. Then in 2022, California passed a windfall profits tax bill targeting oil companies. The bill authorized the state to impose penalties on refiners if their profit margins exceeded a threshold yet to be determined during price spikes. The threshold was not defined in the legislation. It was left to the California Energy Commission to determine later. Think about that for a moment. The state passed a law that said, "We are going to punish you for making too much profit, but we won't tell you what is too much until after you have made it." For a company trying to forecast earnings and manage investor expectations, that is not a regulatory framework. That is a trap. Within 6 months, Chevron CFO told analysts on an earnings call that California's regulatory environment had become unpredictable and hostile. The stock dipped slightly. Investors started asking questions, but still no announcement. Not yet. Then came the permitting crisis. In 2023, Chevron applied for permits to upgrade its Richmond refinery, a facility that processes over 250,000 barrels of crude oil a day and supplies gas stations throughout the Bay Area. The upgrades were necessary to meet new air quality standards and to improve safety systems after a 2012 fire had sent thousands of residents to hospitals with respiratory issues. The permit application was submitted in January. By July, it still hadn't been approved. By December, still nothing. Chevron's engineers were ready, contractors were on standby, the money was allocated, but the California Air Resources Board, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and 3 separate environmental review panels all had overlapping jurisdiction, and none of them could agree on the sequence of approvals. Translation: the state was so bureaucratically gridlocked that it couldn't even approve a project designed to make a refinery cleaner and safer. By early 2024, Chevron had lost 18 months of upgrade work. The refinery was operating under temporary waivers that were about to expire. If the waivers expired without the upgrades being completed, the refinery would be forced to reduce production or shut down units entirely. That was when the first domino fell. In March 2024, Chevron announced it would close one of its smaller refineries in Kern County. The facility employed 340 workers, processed 45,000 barrels a day. Small by industry standards, but critical for local supply in California's Central Valley. The closure was not framed as an exit, it was framed as economic rationalization. The company said the facility was no longer competitive given the regulatory cost structure. Local officials panicked. Gas prices in Bakersfield rose 38 cents a gallon in 2 weeks. The governor's office issued a statement blaming corporate greed and price gouging. But here is the irony. The state had just made it unprofitable to operate the refinery, then acted shocked when the refinery closed. With one refinery closed, pressure increased on the remaining facilities. Gasoline supply margins in California tightened. Prices became more volatile. Every heatwave summer, every maintenance shutdown, every supply hiccup now had the potential to cause price spikes, because there was less buffer capacity in the system. Then in August 2024, California's Attorney General announced a new investigation into whether oil companies were engaging in anti-competitive behavior by coordinating refinery maintenance schedules to artificially restrict supply and raise prices. Chevron was named as a primary target of the investigation. Company executives were subpoenaed. Internal emails were requested. The investigation was public, high-profile, and politically charged. The Attorney General held press conferences accusing oil companies of manipulating markets and exploiting California families. Here is what no one mentioned. Refinery maintenance is not optional. It is federally mandated under EPA and OSHA regulations. Refineries have to shut down units periodically to inspect equipment, replace corroded pipes, and ensure safety systems are working. The schedules are planned years in advance and coordinated with state energy officials to minimize supply disruptions. Calling this coordination a conspiracy is like calling airlines a cartel because they don't all do maintenance on the same day. But the investigation moved forward anyway. Chevron executives had seen enough. In October 2024, the company's board quietly began exploring relocation options. Houston was the obvious choice. Texas had no state income tax, had a business-friendly regulatory environment, had deep expertise in energy infrastructure, and most importantly, it had political leadership that wanted energy companies to succeed, not to be sued, investigated, and taxed into oblivion. The decision was not made overnight. Chevron had employees in California, had relationships, had community ties. Moving a corporate headquarters is not simple. It involves relocating thousands of employees, renegotiating contracts, restructuring tax obligations. But the math was unavoidable. The company's finance team ran the numbers. Operating in California cost approximately 17% more per refined barrel than operating in Texas or Louisiana after accounting for taxes, regulatory compliance costs, legal reserves, and permitting delays. 17%. Over the course of a decade, that is billions of dollars in lost value. In February 2025, the decision was final. Chevron's board voted to relocate the company's headquarters to Houston, effective in 18 months. The announcement was scheduled for early May, but someone leaked. On April 29th, Bloomberg reported that Chevron was preparing to leave California. The governor's office went into crisis mode. Within hours, the governor scheduled a press conference. He neither confirmed nor denied the report. Instead, he attacked. He called the move corporate blackmail, said Chevron was abandoning the communities that built it, promised to hold the company accountable, and suggested the state could explore legal mechanisms to block the move or impose exit taxes. Let that sink in. The state spent a decade suing, investigating, taxing, and regulating the company, then acted betrayed when the company decided to leave. And that is exactly the point where the official narrative begins to crumble. For years, the state treated Chevron as public enemy number one, as a convenient villain to channel popular anger against fuel prices. Lawsuits, investigations, threats, extra taxes, endless bureaucracy. All of this was piled on as if the company were a problem to be fought, not a structure that supported thousands of jobs and billions in revenue. But the moment the company decides to protect its own survival, the discourse changes. Suddenly it becomes a traitor. It's not irony, it's institutional hypocrisy. The government wanted to play the intimidation game, thinking Chevron had nowhere to go, that it would accept any rule, any cost, any political attack. Only companies don't run on emotion, they run on numbers. When the environment becomes too hostile, when legal risk outweighs potential return, leaving stops being a threat and becomes a fiduciary obligation. Chevron's board didn't have the luxury of sending a political message. They had a legal duty to protect shareholders and ensure the company's long-term viability. Calling the move corporate blackmail is completely inverting logic. Blackmail is when someone uses power to force another to act against their will. Here, the one with coercive power was the state. Lawsuits, taxes, regulations, legal threats, public smear campaigns. Chevron wasn't threatening California. It was reacting to constant pressure from a government that made it clear it didn't want that company there. You can't push someone out of the room and then feign surprise when the person leaves. And the most serious part is that this story isn't about oil, it's about precedent. If a state can treat one of the country's largest companies this way and then try to block it when it decides to leave, what does that say to medium-sized businesses, to startups, to foreign investors? The message is simple and dangerous. You are welcome as long as you are politically useful. When you stop being so, you become a target. And when you try to leave, you become a villain. This type of environment destroys any notion of legal security. Deep down, California created a trap for itself. It turned companies into enemies, economic decisions into political weapons, and the economy itself into an ideological battlefield. And when a giant like Chevron says enough, the government doesn't look at its own choices. It points the finger, screams betrayal, and tries to rewrite history. But the facts remain there. It wasn't Chevron that broke the relationship. It was the state that made it unsustainable. If you made it this far, I want to truly thank you. Because this type of video isn't comfortable, it isn't light, it isn't made to distract. It is made to disturb, to make you think, and to show that behind numbers, charts, and technical decisions, there are real people, real families, and lives that change overnight. Nothing you saw here happened by chance. It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't an unforeseeable crisis. They were human decisions, made by people who will hardly feel in their own pockets the weight of what they caused. The most dangerous thing in all this is that this pattern isn't exclusive to California, nor to this sector, nor to this company. It can repeat anywhere in the world. Whenever politics moves away from reality, whenever ideology speaks louder than common sense, the one who pays the bill is the common worker. It is the one who wakes up early, who depends on the paycheck at the end of the month, who doesn't have a plan B. The difference between stability and despair can be a signature, a stroke of a pen, a decision made far from any personal consequence. Now I need you. If this video made sense, if it opened your eyes, if it showed you something the mainstream media doesn't usually show, subscribe to the channel now. This is what allows me to keep investigating, showing behind the scenes, and bringing the truth without makeup. Hit the like button because that makes this content reach more people who also need to understand what is happening. And answer me in the comments. Should those who take decisions that destroy thousands of jobs be held accountable for it? Yes or no? Your opinion matters, and that is how we create a real debate. Share this video with whoever you think needs to see this. The more people understand what is really behind these stories, the harder it gets to repeat the same mistake without being questioned. The truth hurts, but it is what protects. See you in the next video, and don't let anyone convince you that this was inevitable. It wasn't. It was a choice.